Thank you, Deborah, and thanks to you and to David and everybody else involved for putting together this wonderful meeting. It's a great honor to be here, as I'll explain in a moment, as a somewhat, I feel a somewhat undeserved honor. I'll come to what I mean by that in a moment, but let me just say what I'm planning to try to do in this talk. I want to look first at some similarities between Sellers's version of what I'll be calling Humean expressivism, and I'll explain why I'm calling it that, and that of the people that I've come to call Cambridge pragmatists, and I'll be talking about Ramsey and Blackburn in particular, and I'll also say a little bit more about what I mean by Cambridge pragmatism, which is to some extent a kind of a branding notion, which I find a helpful one in distinguishing some of the themes in Cambridge philosophy over the last century from sorts of things that have been happening elsewhere. Okay, so after saying something about those similarities, I'll say something about the general shape of what I'm calling Humean expressivism and about a particular kind of problem it faces, a problem I'll call here creeping cognitivism. I'll then say something about Sellers's attempts to wrestle with that problem, not under that name, but I hope it'll be clear that it's the same problem. And I'll try to explain why what I take to be Sellers's solution to the problem is the one that Cambridge pragmatists need as well. But then I'll raise a question as to whether Sellers is ready for what I take to be the deflationary metaphysical consequences of Cambridge pragmatism, this Cambridge way of developing Humean expressivism. So I think there's give and take here. I think Sellers clearly has something to offer to this tradition in the response to the creeping cognitivism, but also I think that in the deflationary metaphysics, the Cambridge tradition has something to offer to Sellers. Okay, so that's the plan. So starting with Sellers then, and I mean this in two senses, and the first comes back to what I referred to as my embarrassment. I feel that in this audience, I owe people an apology, or at least a kind of disclaimer about the fact that when it comes to Sellers, I'm a complete beginner, which is why I'm embarrassed to be giving a keynote talk at a Sellers conference. And the fact that I'm such a beginner was sort of brought home to me a few weeks ago when I found this parked outside my house in Cambridge. I thought that perhaps somebody had kindly arranged to give me some lessons before I came here. But unfortunately, no such luck, so what you get is the me who hasn't even had the advantages of those lessons. Okay, so now to Sellers' version of what I'm calling Humean expressivism. And I'll give you a couple of quotes which will be familiar to many of you. Sellers says, "We've learnt the hard way that the core truth of emotivism is not only compatible with, but absurd without, ungrudging recognition of the facts so properly stressed, if misassimilated to the model of describing, by ethical rationalists, that ethical discourse as ethical discourse is a mode of rational discourse." And then he goes on, and this is in Counterfactuals, Dispositions and Causal Modalities, he goes on to say that the same is true in his view about causation. "It's my purpose to argue," he says, "that the core truth of Hume's philosophy of causation is not only compatible with, but absurd without, ungrudging recognition of those features of causal discourse as a mode of rational discourse on which the metaphysical rationalists laid such stress, but also misassimilated to describing." Okay, so what we have here is the idea that in the case of both ethical discourse and causal or modal discourse, Hume got something right. What he got right was the sort of the bit that the emotivists picked up on in the ethical case, or the claim that the causal discourse is not, strictly speaking, in some sense, it's not doing the same job of describing the world. What he got wrong was in thinking that in both cases that put it outside the realm of cognitive or rational discourse. Okay, so a familiar kind of Sellersian point. Now I'm going to give you something which is probably not so familiar to you. It's I'm going to describe some of the points in Frank Ramsey's very late paper, General Propositions on Causality, which was written, I think, September 1929, so it's only about 4 months before his death. The main point in this paper, the one that Ramsey starts with, is a discussion of the status of unrestricted generalizations, things of the form for all x, phi x. And he starts off by saying that contrary to his previous view, he now thinks that these can't be treated as infinite conjunctions. And he says if it's not a conjunction, then it's not a proposition at all. So the core claim is that these sorts of unrestricted generalizations, what Ramsey calls variable hypotheticals, are not propositional. They're doing some other kind of job. He says variable hypotheticals are not judgments, but rules for judging. If I meet a phi, I shall regard it as a psi. And then, and this is one of the interesting things that I think puts Ramsey well, as usual, well ahead of most other people, he recognizes the question of why, if that's what these sorts of judgments are doing, if they're really rules for judging, why in that case do we, for example, disagree about them, say yes or no to them, as Ramsey puts it? As he says, the question arises in what way such an attitude, that is a rule for judging, can be right or wrong. And this brings him to a more general thought, which I hope you can see is, in a sense, very close to Sellers's thought. Ramsey says many sentences express cognitive attitudes without being propositions. And the difference between saying yes or no to them is not the difference between saying yes or no to a proposition. And I think that's exactly the same thought that Sellers has when Sellers is using the term describing, where Ramsey is using the term proposition. But apart from that, it's exactly the same thought, namely that the boundaries of the propositional or descriptive don't line up with the boundaries of the cognitive. The latter is much more inclusive. Another thing that Ramsey raises in this paper, it's a very rich paper, he says at one point, what we have said is apt to leave us muddled and unsatisfied as to what seems the main question, a question not of psychological analysis, but of metaphysics, which is causation a reality or a fiction? And if a fiction, is it useful or misleading, arbitrary or indispensable? So he's saying, in effect, he's been giving this, what he here calls a psychological analysis of causal talk or the use of these sorts of generalizations. That is an analysis in terms of what kinds of attitudes they express. And in effect, he's saying that, look, some people will say that's not the question. The question is whether there's any such thing as causation. Now, Ramsey doesn't really deal with this issue he's raised, but it's clear that he thinks that this is a case where all the interesting work does go on the psychological side. And so he's really putting aside metaphysics, although he's not very explicit about that. But as we'll see, later people in the tradition, in particular Blackburn, do get very explicit about that. Okay, so now I want to say I want to highlight some features of the tradition in general, and I'll use Blackburn to a considerable extent to do that. So here's Blackburn's definition of expressivism. This is from his little dictionary of philosophy about 20 years ago. Blackburn says, expressivism is a term used for those theories of ethical discourse that contrast ethical sentences with expressions of belief. And I want to highlight the fact that he talks about ethical discourse. And that's, in a sense, a strange thing for Blackburn, of all people, to be saying, because he's elsewhere very clear that it's not just a view which is applicable to ethical discourse. So here are some expressivists about other matters, as we've already seen. Sellers about causal modalities and counterfactual conditionals. Ramsey about laws, causation and probability. Wittgenstein about necessity. I'm kind of sticking to, apart from Sellers, I'm sticking to Cambridge people here, but it's easy to think of examples elsewhere, of course. And Blackburn himself rightly stressing the parallel between the moral and the modal cases about probability, causation, and necessity. Okay, so that's the expressivist view. And the common concern in all these views is a concern to explain one or other piece of language in terms of what we do with it, what practical role it plays in our lives, rather than in what we might call metaphysical terms, for example, by looking for truth makers for the claims in question. So it's doing exactly what Ramsey was doing for generalizations and causation and general propositions and causality, and it's doing exactly what Sellers is doing and doing exactly what Blackburn himself is doing. Okay, so that's the general view. And I want to highlight two theses which normally go together in such a view. And I call them the negative thesis and the positive thesis. The negative thesis tells us in what I'll call semantic terms what the vocabulary in question, say ethical vocabulary or causal vocabulary, what according to the expressivist it's not doing. Namely that it's not descriptive or it's not fact-stating or not cognitive or whatever. Now, we've seen that in the case of Ramsey and Sellers, they wouldn't express that thesis in terms of the term cognitive, but they do express it in other ways. So Ramsey says that generalizations are not propositions. Sellers says that ethical talk and causal talk is not descriptive. So the negative thesis is certainly still there. The positive thesis tells us in what I'll call pragmatic terms what the vocabulary in question is doing, namely that it's expressing evaluative attitudes or dispositions to follow a rule or something of that kind. Okay, so normally the viewing combines these two kinds of theses. And I just want to flag two questions at this point. One is the question as to whether both theses are essential to a view of this kind. And later on I'm going to argue that the answer to that is no. We can get by and should get by with just one of them. The other question is whether the notion of expressing an attitude is the only kind of pragmatic function that might be relevant in the positive thesis. And I want to answer no to that too, but again, I want to come back to that. Okay. Here's another slightly modified definition from Blackburn's Dictionary of Philosophy. And it's a definition of his own distinctive position that he calls quasi-realism. He defines it like this. He says, it's a position holding that an expressivist account of ethics, again, he restricts it to ethics for some bizarre reason, which is, as I said, quite in conflict with his own views. A position holding that an expressivist account of ethics can explain and make legitimate sense of the realist-sounding discourse within which we promote and debate moral views. This is in opposition to writers who think that if expressivism is correct, then our ordinary ways of thinking in terms of a moral truth or of knowledge or of the independence of ethical facts from our subjective sentiments must all be in error, reflecting a mistaken realist metaphysics. A quasi-realist seeks to earn our right to talk in these terms on the slender expressivist basis. Okay, and I want to sort of highlight 2 points about this. One is that, in effect, a large part of the quasi-realist project is the project of explaining what we might call the cognitive character of moral discourse. So to put it in Ramsey's terms, why we say yes or no to it. That was the question that Ramsey raised about judgments thought of as rules. And that's, really that's the core of quasi-realism. It's that project of explaining the cognitive character given the expressive or pragmatic starting point. The second thing I want to highlight about this passage is the way in which it's bringing out the idea that expressivists don't need to be anti-realists. As Blackburn says, This view is in opposition to writers who think that if expressivism is correct, then our ordinary ways of thinking in terms of a moral truth must all be in error, reflecting a mistaken realist metaphysics. So quasi-realism is opposing that kind of anti-realist metaphysics. And this is something that Blackburn is very explicit about in several places. I'll give you a couple of examples. This one's from an appendix in his book Ruling Passions from the late 90s. The appendix consists of his answer, a list of kind of characteristic questions that he says that he often gets in response to his view, and his answers to them. And question 18 says, "Aren't you really trying to defend our right to talk as if there were moral truths, although in your view there aren't any really?" And his answer to that, as you can see, is quite emphatic. He says, "No, no, no. I do not say that we can talk as if kicking dogs were wrong when really it isn't wrong. I say that it is wrong. So it is true that it's wrong. It is really true that it's wrong. And so this is an example of a moral truth. So there are moral truths." This misinterpretation is curiously common. Anyone advancing it, Blackburn says, must believe themselves to have some more robust, metaphysically heavyweight conception of what it would be for there to be moral truths really. And compared with this genuine article, I only have us talking as if there are moral truths really. I deny that there is any such coherent conception. So you see, at the core of this is a kind of deflationism about metaphysics, a rejection of the idea that there is a substantial metaphysical question which the quasi-realism just doesn't touch. I think a good way to put this is in terms of rejecting both realism and anti-realism in the usual traditional debates. And that's a view that we can find explicit in Carnap, in Empiricism, Semantics, and Ontology. As far as I know, Blackburn doesn't appeal to Carnap, but I think one of the good things about bringing in Carnap in this context is he does make that dialectical move absolutely explicit. So it's not realism, it's not anti-realism in the traditional sense. It's a sort of deflationary rejection of that debate. That's from the late 90s, but Blackburn was onto this much earlier. I should say he's not always entirely consistent. So in some places you'll find himself calling himself an anti-realist. But as it were, when he does get it right, he was doing so much earlier, and this is from the early paper Morals and Modals. He says, "What then is the mistake of describing such a philosophy, quasi-realism, as holding that we talk as if there are necessities when really there are none? It is the failure to notice that the quasi-realist need allow no sense to what follows the as if," that's the claim that there are necessities underlined there, "except one in which it's true. And conversely, he'd need allow no sense to the contrasting proposition," that's the one now underlined, "there are none," in which it in turn is true. So again, it's the rejection. The crucial point is the rejection of any sort of independent standpoint over and above that of the ordinary talk, which the quasi-realist is proposing to explain. Okay, so properly done then, this kind of Humean expressivism goes hand in hand with this kind of deflationary attitude to metaphysics. Summing up then, I think we can say that Blackburn seems close to Sellars in four respects. So they both find a core truth in Hume. They both see the analogy between the moral and the modal cases. They both insist that this insight be rendered compatible with the fact that moral and modal discourse presents itself as a rational discourse, as Sellars puts it. But they both still take for granted the so-called bifurcation thesis. That is, the view that there is some useful distinction between descriptive and non-descriptive, though perhaps quasi-descriptive, uses of declarative language. So in those passages from Sellars we had at the beginning, he was saying that the Humeans were right in thinking that moral talk and causal talk was not descriptive. They were just wrong in thinking that it wasn't cognitive. Okay, and this brings me to the problem I want to call creeping cognitivism. So Blackburn, Sellers, and Ramsey too, as we saw, are all local expressivists. So they hold that some statements are propositions, as Ramsey puts it, or are genuinely descriptive, as Sellers and Blackburn put it. But there's an issue about what this special status can amount to if it's going to come apart from cognitive. Now, this problem is particularly acute for people who are, for other reasons, minimalists about the various notions like truth and reference that you might try to use to draw this distinction. And that's the problem that Jamie Dreyer has called creeping minimalism. But the point I want to make is that for Ramsey, Sellers, and Blackburn, you can think of it as kind of internally generated. So it's a product of their willingness to concede that the domains in question are cognitive. And that pushes them down a road towards having to come up with some hard answer to the question, well, if they're cognitive, then what does it mean to say that they're not propositional or that they're not descriptive? And to his great credit, Sellers sees that that's a very difficult problem. I think he sees it more clearly than Blackburn does. So in the next section, I want to give you some passages in which Sellers is wrestling with this problem, and then say something about the kind of view he comes to in the light of that. Okay, so this the place to start, I think, is with his paper in the Carnap volume. I'll come to that. Setting up the framework. We've seen that Sellers thinks that Humean insights about the function of certain vocabularies, say the moral and the modal vocabularies, are compatible with the observation that these vocabularies are also rational discourses. He says at one point, I think this is from the Carnap paper, it's just as proper to say of statements of the form Jones ought to do A, that they are true, as it is to say this of mathematical, geographical, or semantical statements. Okay, so there he's emphasizing the fact that prescriptive or normative claims are properly called true or false. So he's not an old-fashioned non-cognitivist who wanted to deny that kind of thing about evaluative claims. Yet he's also relying on the bifurcation thesis, as I said. He wants to say that evaluative and modal discourse is not, as he puts it, properly assimilated to describing. But he sees that there's potential trouble here and that it's by no means easy to say what describing means. And this is his attempt from the Carnap paper written in 1956. He says the concept of a descriptive term is by no means intuitively clear. It's easier to specify kinds of terms which are not descriptive than to single out what it is that descriptive terms have in common. Thus, I think it would be generally agreed that the class of non-descriptive terms includes, besides logical terms in a suitably narrow sense, prescriptive terms and the logical and causal vocabularies. Okay, so that, according to Sellers, is some examples, but what's the category? What is it that distinguishes these cases? What is it to describe? Must one be describing an object if one says something about it that's either true or false? Scarcely for modals in even prescriptive statements, e.g. Jones ought to make amends, can be correctly said to be either true or false. Perhaps to describe an object is to specify some of its qualities and or relations. Unfortunately, the terms quality and relation raise parallel difficulties. Is it absurd to speak of goodness as a prescriptive quality? So we're back with the question, he says, what is it to describe? In my opinion, he says, the key to the answer is the realization that describing is internally related to explaining in that sense of explanation which comes to full flower in scientific explanation. In short, causal explanation. A descriptive term is one which, in its basic use, properly replaces one of the variables in the dialogue schema. What brought it about that x is phi? The fact that y is psi, where what is requested in a causal explanation. So this is an appeal to this kind of Eleatic principle that Bill mentioned yesterday as a way of trying to give us a criterion for what counts as genuine description. Okay, so that was the proposal in the Carnap paper, but Sellers wasn't happy with it for very long, and so I'm now going to give you some of the Sellers-Chisholm correspondence written in the following year, in which, among other things, he distances himself from that suggestion. So Sellers says here, when I have said that semantical statements convey descriptive information but do not assert it, I've not meant to imply that semantical statements only convey and do not assert. They make semantical assertions. Nor is convey, as I have used it, a synonym for evince or express, as the motivists have used this term. I've certainly not wished to assimilate semantical statements to ejaculations or symptoms. It might be worth noting at this point that, as I see it, it's just as proper to say of statements of the form Jones ought to do A that they are true as it is to say this of mathematical, geographical, or semantical statements. This, of course, does not preclude me from calling attention to important differences in the logics of these statements. I quite agree then, he says, that it's no more of a solution to our problem simply to say that semantical statements are unique than it would be a solution of the corresponding problem in ethics simply to say that the prescriptive statements are unique. What is needed is a painstaking exploration of statements belonging to various prima facie families with a view to discovering specific similarities and differences in the way in which they behave. Okay, so here we have the idea that different bits of language are doing different jobs, and we need to sort it all out and look at it case by case. And then we come to the term descriptive again. He says, I also agree that the term descriptive is of little help. Once the journeyman task is well underway, it may be possible to give a precise meaning to this technical term. Presumably this technical use would show some measure of continuity with our ordinary use of describe. I made an attempt along this line in my Carnap paper, though I'm not very proud of it. On the other hand, as philosophers use the term today, it means little that's definite apart from the logician's contrast of descriptive expression with logical expression. On this use ought would be a descriptive term, and the moral philosopher's contrast of descriptive with prescriptive. According to both these uses, S means P would be a descriptive statement, whereas Sellers is trying to say that S means P is not a descriptive statement, it's something that goes on the non-descriptive side, but he hasn't yet got an account of what it means to be descriptive or non-descriptive. And so he's pretty much rejecting the attempt he'd made in the Carnap paper the previous year, but he's kind of floundering around, and at this stage he doesn't come up with any positive proposal. He comes back to the issue to some extent in Science and Metaphysics a few years later. And this is from the preface, where he's talking about what he calls the heart of the enterprise. He says, I attempt to spell out the specific differences of matter-of-factual truth. And here I think by matter-of-factual truth, he means something like the genuinely descriptive stuff. He says levels of factual discourse are distinguished and shown to presuppose a basic level in which conceptual items represent or picture, in a sense carefully to be distinguished from the semantical concepts of reference and predication. So one of the things that's becoming clear here is that he's recognizing explicitly that this, to the extent that there is some sort of notion of genuinely factual or genuinely descriptive, it's not to be drawn in terms of the semantical notions such as truth and reference. Later in the book, he says, my concern will, and this is the introduction to, I think it is chapter 7, he says, my concern will be with what might initially be called factual truth. This phrase is intended to cover both the truth of propositions at the perceptual and introspective level and the truth of those propositions which, though empirical in the broad sense, that their authority ultimately rests on perceptual experience, involve the complex techniques of concept formation and confirmation characteristic of theoretical science. Since the term fact is properly used as a synonym for truth, even in its most generic sense, so that we can speak of mathematical and even ethical facts, factual in the more specific sense indicated above should be thought of as short for matter of factual and equivalent to Leibniz's technical term, vérité de fait. Okay, so but again, I think this is simply a gesture towards what he needs, which is, in effect, a distinction between the genuinely factual and the factual in the generic sense, which, as he says explicitly here, is applicable to, say, mathematical and ethical facts. But as far as I can see, it's really only a gesture. Telling us that it's equivalent to Leibniz's technical term, as if that would solve the problem, seems to me to be avoiding the problem rather than telling us what his solution to it is. But what he is explicit about, and this is the bit that I think that we need to take over into the Cambridge pragmatism. He's explicit that there are two kinds of truth in the picture. There's this generic notion, according to which, as he says, for a proposition to be true is for it to be assertable, where this means not capable of being asserted, which it must be to be a proposition at all, but correctly assertable. Assertable, that is, in accordance with the relevant semantical rules. True then means semantically assertable or assertable, and the varieties of truth correspond to the relevant varieties of semantical rule. Okay, so that's the generic notion, which is supposed to apply to all kinds of esoteric vocabularies, so the mathematical ones and the modal ones and the moral ones, and so on. But then there's this more specific notion, which is only supposed to apply to the genuinely matter-of-factual vocabularies. And here I won't quote Sellers, I'll quote Jim O'Shea instead. Jim says, Sellers also argues that in addition to this generic notion, there's a further correspondence dimension to truth in the specific case of what he calls basic matter-of-factual truths. This is a descendant of Wittgenstein's picture theory in the Tractatus. Basic matter-of-factual propositions in some sense form pictures or cognitive maps or representations of how objects or events in the world are related. Okay, and Sellers is very clear that these two notions need to be kept apart. So as he says, the relation of picturing is a mode of correspondence other than truth, other than that generic notion of truth. Elsewhere, picturing is a complex matter-of-factual relation and as such belongs in quite a different box from the concepts of denotation and truth. And again, it's important to, quote, grasp the difference between the primary concept of factual truth, as truth is correct picture, and the generic concept of truth as assertability, which involves the quite different mode of correspondence in terms of which the correspondence statement, a equivalent statement, that 2 + 2 = 4 is true if and only if 2 + 2 = 4 is to be understood. Okay, so in all of these cases, he's emphasizing the difference between the sort of picturing kind of truth that we have for genuinely matter-of-factual vocabularies and this generic notion of truth which works across all the vocabularies. Now let's go back and take that view back into the framework that I spelled out before for what I'm calling Humean expressivism. Recall that, as I described it, this view typically has two theses to it. The negative thesis, which tells us in semantic terms what the vocabulary is not doing, so it's not descriptive, it's not fact-stating, and the positive thesis, which tells us in pragmatic terms what the vocabulary in question is doing. And the problem of creeping cognitivism is the question as to how we formulate the negative thesis if notions such as cognitive or truth and reference are now being held to have a proper place on both sides of the bifurcation. As Sellers explicitly says that the term cognitive does, and as he explicitly says that his sort of generic notion of truth does. So Sellers recognizes then that the generic notions, the semantic notions, are not going to ground the negative thesis. Now, my proposal, which I think is the one that Sellers really needs too, is to simply abandon the negative thesis and see all the work done by these sorts of expressivist views as being done at the level of the pragmatic stuff in the positive thesis. Now, that means for Sellers that Sellers has to treat the notion of picturing as, to the extent that it can be made out, as lying at the pragmatic level too, as just another kind of thing that a particular vocabulary can do. But it seems to me that that's the right move for him to make. But if we go this way, then this is a view in which we've entirely given up on the bifurcation thesis. That is, entirely given up on the idea that there's a useful distinction to be drawn between descriptive and non-descriptive uses of language. A distinction which, in some sense, lay at the level of the negative thesis. Now, without the negative thesis, if we simply prepare to drop the negative thesis, then we don't need a bifurcation at the semantic level. So there's nothing but homogeneity there, as Sellers himself says. But we find all the plurality we need, all the differences in the logical roles of the different vocabularies, as Sellers says. We find all that at the underlying pragmatic level. But if we do go this way, if we do abandon the semantic bifurcation thesis, then this gives us not a local expressivism, which was what we had before, but something which could appropriately be called a global expressivism or a global pragmatism. Now, I think that, this is a resolution that I think is the sort of logical endpoint of say, Blackburn's program. But I also think it's something which is, in one sense, more or less explicit in Sellers as well, because of the clear way in which he distinguishes these two notions of truth. And it works because he keeps these two notions apart. He recognizes that the one is generic and the other is specific. So semantic truth is global and picturing is local. In some recent work, I've drawn a corresponding, or what I take to be a corresponding distinction between two levels, a kind of generic level and a local level, by suggesting that we draw a distinction within current philosophical uses of notions of representation. We sort of divide them up roughly into two families. And I call these families the e-representational family, where the emphasis is on something like environment tracking and covariation, indicator relations. So this is the kind of notion which goes along naturally with thinking about things like how frogs keep track of flies and that kind of thing, and how thermometers keep track of temperature. And then the other cluster is what I call the I-representational notions. And these tend to be defined in terms of systemic, functional, or inferential, or computational, some kind of role in some sort of network of this kind. For example, in terms of the idea of being a move in the game of giving and asking for reasons, in Bob's sense. And what I've suggested that various notions from each of these clusters may well be useful, may well be things that we need for various theoretical purposes, but what we need to insist on is that they're different things, and we should avoid confusing them. So we should be insisting that they live in different boxes in just the way that Sellers insists for his two notions of truth. And so sort of representing Sellers roughly in my terminology, picturing them becomes an e-representational notion, whereas Sellers' generic notion of truth, S-assertability, becomes an I-representational notion. And we've seen that for Sellars, as for me, keeping these notions distinct is the key to the project of combining the insights of Humean expressivism with the recognition that moral and modal claims are full-blown truth-valuable assertions. But for Sellars too, I think, the upshot has to be a kind of global expressivism or global pragmatism. That is the kind of global anti-traditional representationalism that comes from recognizing that the notion of propositional content, notions like that, are I-representational notions, they live at the generic level, whereas word natural world correspondence, that lives at what I call the E-representational notion. So they live quite different theoretical lives. And I think traditional representationalism is really the view that you get if you don't keep those things distinct. If you think that the sort of E-representation relation of correspondence has to be the kind of model for what propositional content depends on. Okay. But as I said earlier, one of the elements you can find in the Cambridge version of Humean expressivism, and find particularly clearly in Blackburn, is this metaphysical deflationism. So what I want to finish with is a question as to whether Sellars needs to go that way too. I've said that to make the kind of view work, the kind of view that separates the E-representational from the I-representational notions, to make that view work, we need to distinguish, we need to recognize that there's a kind of corresponding distinction that needs to be drawn in the class of contemporary philosophical uses of the notion of world. So I want to say that about uses of the world too, we need to draw a kind of corresponding distinction. So we need to think about, on the one hand, there are cases in which what's being meant by world is something like the natural world, the world as described by natural science. And then there are contexts in which what's being meant by world is something like all the facts, everything we take to be the case, something of that kind. And that's a much more generic notion because it's equally at home for, say, mathematical facts, moral facts. And so, in effect, this is the point that Sellars was recognizing when I had that passage a few slides back, where Sellars was saying that the notion of fact has a generic use too, in accordance with which we can say that there are mathematical facts and moral facts. And then he's looking for a more specific sense of it too, when he's trying to talk about matter-of-factual discourse. That distinction at the level of facts is in effect this one that I think we need to recognize at the level of talking about the world. And my question is really whether we can push Sellars in this direction and push him towards the kind of metaphysical deflationism that goes with it, or whether he's still too wedded to an orthodox naturalism, which wants to give a kind of metaphysical priority to the E-world, to the world of natural science. And I'm not going to try and answer this question. It's something I want some of you to answer for me. But here's another way of putting it. We can think of it as the question as to whether Sellars can accept for facts, as he explicitly accepts for expressions, that, as he puts it, once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe, the way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many, Sellars says expressions, I want to ask, can we say facts instead, which empiricists have relegated to second-class citizenship in discourse, are not inferior, just different. So in other words, can Sellars accept that mathematical facts, moral facts, modal facts are not inferior, just different? Now, I think that he has to accept that. But the consequences of accepting it seems to be in tension with the kind of naturalism which wants to say that in some sense the natural facts are superior to all the others. And keep in mind that this formulation was from 1956 or so, when Sellers still thought that he had a non-deflationary account of describing, which he soon abandoned. And things obviously just get even worse if you don't have that. Okay, so just to sum up. I think that Sellers already has the response that Humean expressivism needs to creeping cognitivism, and it involves rejecting the bifurcation thesis at a semantic level, and hence, in that sense, becoming a global expressivist or global pragmatist. I think the result is, in an important sense, an anti-representationalist position in that it gives up a theoretical linkage at the core of orthodox representationalism, namely the view that propositional content and word-natural world correspondence live in the same box. It involves insisting that they live in different boxes. And in that sense, then I think Sellers is a kind of proto-global expressivist, and that Cambridge pragmatists should follow him in that. But I think that Sellers needs the metaphysical quietism that Cambridge had already with, I think, with Ramsey, though Ramsey didn't have time to sort of answer his own question, but I think that's what he had in mind in saying, you know, haven't we answered the question about the metaphysics of causation? I think he raised that question in order to dismiss it. And then we have it much more explicitly in Wittgenstein and in Blackman, for example. Okay, so that's it. Let me just finish with a word of thanks to my sponsor and to say that I hope we've learned something. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions. I think we're off and running.
Thank you so much. I thought that was very enlightening. I really enjoyed it, and I agree with just about everything.
Good, that's the kind of question I like.
Yeah. Well, the question's going to come from a slightly different perspective. I can imagine a certain McDowellian type character who, while I think with you in rejecting the kind of metaphysical priority of an e-world, insofar as he rejects the kind of the Kantian in itself notion, or its correlate in experience, sheer receptivity, is nonetheless perhaps not entirely satisfied with the key notion here of truth being one that is at its core a pragmatic notion, is going to push you for an explanation of how we get the kind of relevant sort of friction, if you will, with the world. So, I mean, have you considered that is that a potential objection to this view? It seemed like right at the root you wanted Sellers to go pragmatic all the way.
I mean, I'm surprised to hear it described as a McDowellian objection.
Okay.
I was thinking you were going to offer something different as a McDowellian objection. I mean, I think it's asking the question of where does this sense of where does this kind of friction that seems to be there in a notion of truth come from on this pragmatic account?
Right.
That's a very good question, but I think that there is a pragmatist answer to that, which is in effect that the friction is at the core of truth and falsity and associated notions of disagreement. So the friction is part of that generic package, and then so the right way to think of the kind of the quasi-realist question, or the question as to why for Sellers, say, moral or modal vocabulary takes cognitive form, is as a question about why, given the pragmatic expressive story about what that vocabulary is doing, why is it appropriate to subject it to that kind of friction? I think that's really exactly the question that Ramsey was asking. What are we doing when we say yes or no to expressions of rules of judgment? So it's a good question, but I think there's an answer to it within the.
Modest mention his classic article, "Truth is Convenient Friction." Let's let this out.
Thank you, Bob. Yes.
Okay, so I'm completely on board with your entire project here, and I just want to sort of think through, or help you think through, what's at stake in this distinction between the E world and the I world. I was wondering if it might be at all helpful for you to take on board or refashion for your own purposes the distinction between environment and world, which is a distinction that McDowell has, and he takes it from Gadamer, and the whole tradition, and Heidegger has this kind of distinction. And there might be a way in which you can think about environment as having a kind of priority over world with regard to causal explanations. And I was wondering if that might be helpful for you to think through
so
here.
that sounds like, I agree that I don't know all of the tradition that you're referring to, but I agree that the term environment is one that we much more naturally associate with something like the physical or the natural environment, rather than the term world. And so, as a way of spelling out what I mean by E-world, I think it's a very helpful suggestion. So I think I can take that on. But I just want to emphasize that I'm not trying to be too prescriptive here. As in the case of E-representation and I-representation, all I'm trying to do is just call attention to large clusters which I think are there in the contemporary literature and philosophy and neighboring disciplines like cognitive science, and to say it's very helpful to recognize that these clusters are not all attempting to get at the same thing, but they're attempting to get at different things. And then I think there's a corresponding move which is helpful in the case of the notion of world. And I think the notion of world gets even less attention within philosophy, or at least the bits of it that I'm familiar with, and it's even more one of these things that people just think they're entitled to talk about. The world. I don't know, that's just one of these notions you can just have, and I want to challenge that and say, no, look. And again, I think that I can treat Sellars as an ally in that respect, although he's not nearly as explicit about that on the sort of metaphysical side as he is about the distinction we need in the case of truth.
So I wonder, you expressed some concern at the end with regard to whether this reading was going to push Sellars to have to revise his views about metaphysics and the priority of, I take it something like the priority of the scientific image. But I wonder, so how's this as a proposal? And tell me whether you think this would be the sort of thing that would allow Sellars to capture something like that priority. So it just turns out in the pragmatics that's characteristic of scientific discourse, we use discoveries that we take to be e-representational about the way things are in the world to revise claims we make in other sorts of discourse. So if we discover that it turns out, I don't know, the heavens aren't moved by angelic essences, then that forces us to change our views about, say, relationships between people and what they think is going on in the celestial heavens. But that there isn't a similar kind of revision from the other direction. So supposing we have to get along with one another in terms of a moral framework doesn't force us to think that there is something out there that we're picturing. So in virtue of...
Okay, good. But what I'm inclined to say is that makes science look privileged from the perspective of the scientific enterprise. But that's different from some kind of, first philosophy, metaphysical notion of privilege. I mean, of course, science looks privileged from its own point of view. I mean, presumably any respectable language game is going to look sort of special from its own point of view. I mean, if you're using the moral vocabulary, then you're going to might be struck by the fact that if you talk some other way, then you wouldn't be able to make these moral distinctions, which are, from this moral standpoint, important to you. So I agree that there is a kind of primacy there, but I don't think it's the kind of primacy that a traditional naturalist wants. I don't think it's strong enough for the traditional naturalists.
Thank you very much for that talk. I want to see what your thoughts are on a position that seems to me maybe a little bit even more radical, a departure from traditional modes of thought than what you've offered us here. So I agree that we want to distinguish between what you're calling E and I representation, but the more radical aspect that I guess I'm hoping to recommend is that we see what you're calling E representation as not anything to do with representation at all, that it's not a kind of representation, that it has no connection with picturing or truth or correspondence or any semantic notion at all. And the reason I want to recommend that is because if we do admit that there are two notions of representation, then that distinction ramifies into, as you noted, into now we have two kinds of world, right? We have the natural world and then the unnatural world, I suppose, right? And I think that distinction is going to be the thin end of the wedge that gets metaphysical questions of the kind that I think you're trying to deflate back onto the scene, right? And then because that distinction then gives us a further distinction between science and not science, between the physical and the non-physical. And these are all the kinds of metaphysical distinctions that I agree with you we ought not to take seriously. We should just, they're not tenable dualisms, so to speak. And I think that if you start off saying that the E representation and I representation that those are both coherent, though different notions of different kinds of representation, that is going to lead to problems. It's not going to give us a sufficiently deflationary view.
Good. Let me see if I can hang on to the entire sort of train of thought there. But I mean, this kind of response, saying, in response to my distinction between E representation and I representation, response which says one of those things is not properly called representation, is something I get quite a bit. But I get it pretty much equally on both sides. And that seems to me to be some sort of sociological evidence that there are at least these two clusters in the contemporary literature. Now, I don't really care what we end up calling them. If you don't like the term representation, I'm happy to call them something else. But now coming to your main point, whether as it were, having the notion of E-representation on the table does lead back into metaphysics in this way. I'm inclined to think that it doesn't, as long as we keep our eye on the fact that all the distinctions are being drawn on the linguistic side. So the distinction between, say, physical world talk and mathematical talk or something, that distinction is all being drawn on the side of the talk. And as long as we hang on to that and refuse to slip over the line back into metaphysics, then I don't think that there's a real threat of the kind.
Yeah, I guess the worry that I'm having is that all of the same kinds of problems that we've had on the world side, where people doing metaphysics and trying to solve what you've called placement problems, trying to figure out, well, how do moral facts fit in with the natural facts, or how do mental facts fit in with the physical facts, that we're going to get the same kinds of problems if we move all of those debates onto the linguistic side. You're going to get problems, well, how do moral sentences fit in with non-moral ones, or how do mental sentences fit in with the non-mental ones? And those questions seem to me to make equally little sense. They fit in.
Okay. So we simply disagree about that. So I think that when they're moved onto the linguistic side, then there's a long tradition we can appeal to, this expressivist tradition of coming up with answers to them. So we've got stories about what the particular functions done by the particular vocabularies are. Well, it might not be the right story, but at least there's work to be done there. Sort of the work of explaining why natural creatures like us come to talk in all these various ways. And Sellers was obviously doing lots and lots of that kind of work. So if there's a challenge there, I don't think it's going to be a sort of general challenge to that move to the linguistic side. It's going to have to be a particular challenge to the particular story. Of course, some of them might be wrong, but then we look for something better.
All right. I may be the only person in this room, but I like metaphysics. So I'm going to just start out with that. A lot of what you were saying reminded me actually of some of the stuff that Crispin Wright was doing in distinguishing this minimal notion of truth, where we can talk about facts and correspondence with the world and whatnot. I think he called them thin facts when we just had minimal truth. But then he adds on to that there are at least possibly what he calls these realist relevant axes. It seemed to me that one, I know you're trying to keep it on the linguistic side, but it seemed to me that one could take your e-representation as a sort of realist relevant axis that you add on to the more minimal thing. And then if there are things that are realistically robust in that way, why not just embrace them as something that has primary status or more metaphysical oomph than the things that don't have that additional, that don't meet that additional realist relevant axis? So I guess why would Sellers have to go the more minimalist route? Why can't he keep his more robust naturalism?
Well, let's see. I mean, there are lots of things I like about Crispin's program, and I think that the kind of distinctions that he calls attention to about the way in which different vocabularies work. I forget all those terms of his cognitive command and so on. I mean, I think that's a worthwhile project, and it's sort of associated with the fact that different kinds of vocabularies participate in what, following Ramsey, you might call the game of saying yes and no to different extents. And I think Ramsey was already kind of onto some of those differences in the case for the examples he was talking about. And so I think the project of sort of mapping those differences and then trying to explain them in terms of your story about the functions of the vocabularies is a very good one. And I tried to do some of that stuff in some of my early work, in fact, in The Function of Truth. But so that's a way of taking on board those kind of intuitions that Crispin has, but putting them squarely on the kind of pragmatic or linguistic side rather than on the metaphysical side. Though seeing that they can be an explanation for why we have the sort of metaphysical intuition that somehow say some kinds of things are in some sense more real than others. And even someone like McDowell will allow that there's a kind of subjectivity to say color judgments which you don't have, say, in physics. So I mean, we agree that there's sort of work to be done there. I think if we disagree, it's about to what extent it sort of resuscitates the traditional kind of metaphysics.
Okay, thank you.
One might go into your talk as a metaethical expressivist and come out as a Morean non-naturalist. And that's a worry. Because, I mean, for me, what drove me to expressivism in the first place was the restriction that naturalism places on metaethics, for example. I think that naturalism, in that sense, as a restriction, is often really useful. How can we understand that restriction now?
Good. Okay, so I mean, I think the restriction is still there, but it's a restriction in terms of what I would put on the side of what I call subject naturalism rather than object naturalism. So the restriction is that we want to be able to explain what we're doing with the various vocabularies in terms which with the sort of explanatory materials that we have are roughly naturalism about ourselves. So it's true that you end up with a position which in some ways looks a lot like Morean intuitionism. It's just that nowhere in the story do you need something which is just a kind of raw faculty of intuition, because you've got your more or less Humean story about how we come to talk this way. But I mean, it's the sense in which it's like the Morean view is that you end up accepting, as we saw in that passage from Blackburn, yes, you know, there are moral facts. And Blackburn could have extended his long list of ways of saying that by saying, you know, we intuit moral reality. So I think you're right to note the sort of similarity, but I think I don't think the puzzle that sort of drives those metaethical inquiries has gone away. I think it's still there in the form of the question: how do we explain why natural creatures like us are behaving in this way?
We have just a couple of minutes left.
Thanks to you. I find that very compelling. And so I'm trying to think of, and the way you characterize it at the end, I thought was just right. There seems to be something different Sellers wants to hang on to, and why? Why shouldn't he? So I'm thinking of e-representation, or picturing, as he'd call it. And I'm thinking of how difficult it is to sort of spell that out so that that kind of tracking or naturalistic theory of representation lines up with what we do in natural science. So one pressure is to take observation to be, you know, sort of consilience, non-inferential response, a very pragmatic. That's one of the things we do. And that can become very loose when you look at the many different things we do along that observational line of work. And Quine runs into this, trying to use stimulus meaning, and that doesn't track it in the right way. So I think Sellers has an Eliatic element. The causal element comes back in trying to specify. He thinks, well, we're going to need something that's a little more rigorous. It's going to have to be this extensional mapping that, and he's highly committed to them what that has to do. And I think some critics find that challenge to, you know, we're not going to get natural science to line up with that kind of more robust notion of mapping, that sense of e-representation. The many different things we do, the ways, you know, it's easy to slide into coping. It's kind of creeping coping.
Okay, good. No, thank you, Jim. That's helpful, and it reminds me of another way you could kind of draw a connection between that issue and something which is also there in general propositions and causality. In one of the notes at the end of general propositions and causality, Ramsey says something like my general view is that science is for I think he says predicting, not describing, or something like that. So it's this very pragmatic view of what science is for that I think he got from Peirce. But I mean, a question you can ask at that point is that the only possible way you have to go once you recognize the sort of pragmatic character of modal talk and so on, or can you preserve the idea of some kind of ideal descriptive core? And maybe you can relate that question to what Sellers is trying to do. I'd like to talk about this.
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk and discussion.